What are we discussing on today's podcast, you ask? Well, with the D-backs struggling in the second half, we have to discuss why all eyes are on Mike Hazen and this D-backs front office as we approach the MLB trade deadline. Then speaking of trade deadline, part two with Javier Reyes of Locked On Padres, where we are drafting the best trade deadline deals of all time, discussing all that on today's Locked On Diamondbacks podcast.
You are Locked On Diamondbacks, your daily Arizona Diamondbacks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. You're listening to who? Always charismatic host of this podcast, Millard Thomas. I'm a multimedia journalist and I'm a graphic designer, so please go check out my website, millardthomas24.myportfolio.com. On there, you can see all my latest work, from my packages to my articles to my photos and my graphic design. If you want to see more content by me, just follow me on Twitter at CreatorThomas24 from my personal account, or just look up Locked On Diamondbacks on Twitter, Instagram for the podcast handle. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Diamondbacks your first listen every day. I'll not be able to do this podcast without you, my loyal listeners, sharing, subscribing, reviewing, doing all that so I could do this podcast for you. Thank you. It's free and available on all platforms, so please continue to tell your friends. And one of those platforms is YouTube, so please hit subscribe on the Locked On Diamondbacks YouTube channel. Now, for today's podcast, not in this video if you're watching for a YouTube audience, the audio listeners will get part two with Javier Reyes, but for the YouTube audience, we already have the video up of me and Javi drafting the MLB trade deadline deals, the best ones of all time. But for this video, for this audio segment, I want to talk about the D-backs second half of the season and why all eyes are on Mike Hazen and this D-backs front office, because we've heard from Mike Hazen all season about how the D-backs have to be urgent and how they're making moves to try and win this year. And they have shown us some breadcrumbs of that with the Madison Bumgarner DFAing and sending down guys like McCarthy and Alec Thomas when they're struggling and making sure you're always trying to put the best players on the field. But Mike Hazen needs to address the concerns and weaknesses that we see on this team. And he says, we got to stop fixating on the bullpen because there's other weaknesses on this team that have led to the bullpen's meltdowns in recent games in the second half of the season. And I agree with Mike Hazen. There's other weaknesses on this team, like the starting rotation. And all these weaknesses should be addressed. The bullpen being one of them, the starting pitching being another. Maybe you want to go get another outfield or another guy for the left side of your infield. I don't think those are as strong priorities, but definitely more pitching is a need for this D-backs team. And we'll see if Mike Hazen puts his money where his mouth is, because if we go into this deadline, the D-backs, I don't need like a Ohtani level splash, but if we don't even get like a guy like David Robertson or Carlos Estevez or Jordan Hicks, like a solid reliever to put in the back end of your bullpen, or maybe a quality starting pitcher. I mean, even if he's a rental, like if the D-backs are not making any moves to get better, like if they just go out there and get some reliever with like a 5.90 ERA who can throw 98 miles per hour, and they try to convince us they're going to rehabilitate this guy and turn him into a legit weapon, then I'm like, okay, the D-backs are not serious about trying to win this year and are not serious about taking care of business for this season. Everything Mike Hazen has said, I don't know how truthful it is. So Mike Hazen is putting his reputation and his credibility on the line when he says, I care about making moves in terms of urgency and trying to put the best product on the field. Because when you have a team like this who is young, who is cheap, it's easy to build around this team right now and put more expensive pieces and players around them. You're barely paying your starting rotation. Corbin Carroll and Ketel Marte are on very team-friendly deals. Like, this team is not expensive. This is the time to go add a major piece if you need to. I don't think the D-backs have to do that at this trade deadline, but if they want to in free agency, this is the time to spend when you have a cheap roster like this. But at least for this trade deadline, Mike Hazen has to make some moves and upgrade this pitching staff. This D-backs team is 3-9 since the All-Star break. If you remember, they were tied heading into the All-Star break with the LA Dodgers for first place in the NL West. And as we record this podcast, the D-backs are currently on the outside looking in on the NL wildcard. If you could believe that, they're like 4 games back of the division lead from the Dodgers. They're like a half game back of a wildcard spot. The D-backs are spiraling in the second half of the season, and really since like mid-June, this D-backs team hasn't been good. So it's been like a month sample size where this D-backs team has been really struggling. And Mike Hazen can say we're fixating too much on the bullpen, but the bullpen in the first half of the season had a 4.0 ERA flat. Like, they were solid. They were decent. They got the job done. Like, was it the most elite bullpen? No, but they were middle of the pack, which is all the D-backs needed. And like the 7th and 8th inning, the D-backs were really good. They just struggled in that 9th inning in the first half of the season, but because their offense, scored so many runs and their starting rotation was solid, like you were never too worried about the 9th inning too much, because a lot of times you had a 2 or 3 run lead heading into that 9th inning. And the bullpen was good enough at closing games, at least in the first half of the season. But in the second half of the season, the D-backs have the worst bullpen in baseball. The bullpen ERA is like in the 9s. And if Mike Hazen doesn't think that's a big enough problem, I don't think we're watching the same game. I don't think we're watching the same sport. But he is right. It's not just on the bullpen, because you look at the starters ERA, that's gone from a 4.6 in the first half to probably a 5. It was a 5.72, but this hasn't been updated after Zach Gallen's start, where he gives up 5 earned runs. So the D-backs second half starting rotation ERA is probably like a 6 now. It should be better going forward with Merrill Kelly back and healthy, but the D-backs need one more starter. Like, if Zach Gallen would just pitching like he was last year, or at least 90% of how he was last year, he would be running away with the Cy Young Award. Because if you go look at like the ERA leaders in Major League Baseball, like the top 6 or 7 are all in the American League. Like, the ERA leaders in the NL, like the Cy Young Award race is wide open. And Zach Gallen, if he goes on one of those scoreless streaks, he can easily lock down the award. But as it currently stands, I don't even think I would vote for him for the Cy Young Award. And I want him to win the award. I want to see Corbin Carroll win Rookie of the Year. I want to see Zach Gallen win the Cy Young. But right now, Zach Gallen is struggling, and he's become a little bit more prone to giving up the long ball, which was something he was so elite at not doing in the first half of the season. But you look at his last 11 starts, he has 12 home runs allowed in his last 11 starts. Zach Gallen just giving up way too many long balls, way too much hard contact. It feels like he's not fooling as many batters. He can still rack up the strikeouts. He can still make elite pitches, but it feels like batters are kind of locked in on Zach Gallen right now, which is just weird to see, because Zach Gallen has these starts where he pitches into like the 6th or 7th inning, but he still gives up like 4 to 5 runs. It's just been such a weird season for Zach Gallen. He hasn't been terrible, but he has been up and down and just shaky at times. Like, seeing him pitch into the 7th, but still give up like 5 earned runs, it's just been such a weird Zach Gallen feeling. So the pitching in the second half definitely needs to be better. The offense, at least in this series finale, 2 for 16 with runners in scoring position. Yes, they did put up 7 runs, but they left so many runs on the board. This could have been like one of those, like what the D-backs did against the Atlanta Braves. Like, it could have been that kind of game where it was a slugfest. It's a slugfest that goes back and forth, but the D-backs still pull it out in the end. They were not able to do that in this game. But I do think the offensive struggles in the second half, maybe a little bit overrated. From a team perspective, the D-backs offensively are still putting up a lot of the same numbers in terms of average, runners in scoring position, OPS. Like, the D-backs statistically as a team on paper, the offense hasn't really fallen off a lot in the second half. In the 12 games in the second half, they scored at least 5 runs in 7 of them. You can look at the D-backs' best 12-game stretch of the season. They still scored like 5 runs in like 8 of those games if you look at their best stretch of winning games. So the D-backs are not off in terms of scoring runs and bunches from some of their best stretches of the season. Where the D-backs are struggling is their individuals, because the team on paper statistically looks the same, but individually, a lot of it is being carried by the Ketel Martes of the world and a high OPS from Corbin Carroll. But like we've discussed, guys like Lourdes Gurriel and the Christian Walkers have struggled in the second half. So we need more of a balanced attack from this D-backs offense. We're not getting the length from this D-backs lineup right now. So when you're talking about this D-backs offense on paper, the team statistically looks similar, but individually they look way different. And with the trade deadline just a few days away, we need the D-backs to make some kind of moves, get aggressive. Don't just sit on your hands, Mike Hazen. Don't sit on your laurels. Actually go out someone who is quality. I don't want to see someone who's having a poor season that the D-backs are going to try and convince us that they're going to rehabilitate him. I don't want to see that. I just saw Lucas Giolito is going to the LA Angels. He's off the board. That's one of my favorite D-backs targets from this trade deadline. He's off the board. So Mike Hazen's going to have to make some moves. He's going to have to make some calls. And if the D-backs go from a first half where they were sitting comfortably most of the season, going to the All-Star break tied for first place. And then if we look up at the end of the year, the D-backs are on the outside looking in of a postseason berth. Yeah, best believe D-backs nation is not going to be happy.